York ain't New York anymore. How I miss those old pals of mine.
Today, mapping the source of the Nile River is as boring and easy as a Google search. But the mystery intrigued humanity for centuries. In this episode, best-selling author and master storyteller Candice Millard introduces us to the men who won a race worthy of Indiana Jones. But first, hello history lovers and welcome. I'm your host, Dean Karayanis, and this is the History Author Show on iHeartRadio. And a special tip of the hat, as always, to everybody who watches via YouTube. I know that people have a lot of things to watch online, and so I really appreciate everyone who subscribes there and checks out how I try to produce these up to give you that old History Channel golden era feeling. You can find me at historyauthor.com or across social media platforms by navigating through from there. And you can also read my daily columns in the New York Sun to get my analysis of current events through the lenses of what I've learned from all these books behind me. And yes, I really do read them. The latest book on the shelf is Candice Millard's River of the Gods, Genius, Courage, and Betrayal in the Search for the Source of the Nile. In it, we meet three very different men who achieved one of the greatest feats of discovery ever and examine their legacy at the vanguard of colonialism. We last met up with Candice Millard to discuss her book, Hero of the Empire, The Boer War, A Daring Escape, and the Making of Winston Churchill. I often refer to that as his origin story, and as somebody who read even his first-person account of that adventure, this was really a great book, taught me some new things. So I would definitely check that out and check out the interview too. Regular listeners may also have heard me praise Candice Millard's book, Destiny of the Republic, A Tale of Madness, Medicine, and the Murder of a President, as well as The River of Doubt, Theodore Roosevelt's Darkest Journey. For more, you can visit CandiceMillard.com, where you will navigate through to her social media accounts on Twitter and Facebook. Okay, now that we've arrived back in the 19th century's golden age of exploration, let's join Candice Millard and paddle south on the mighty Nile, also known as River of the Gods. And here we are with Candice Millard. She's joining us to chat about her new book, River of the Gods, Genius, Courage, and Betrayal in the Search for the Source of the Nile. Welcome back to the show, Candice.
Thanks so much for having me, Dean. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you for going through the hard work I know you do to bring us another great story, because it's really enjoyable. And as I was thinking about doing this interview, I noticed a thread that I saw going through all of your books, and that's exploration and the quest for knowledge and trying to advance humanity. Mm-hmm. Even in Destiny of the Republic, you begin it at the World Fair, which is showing all this great new technology, and this is the backdrop for the new world that's starting to begin there in James A. Garfield's time, who's a very intellectual man. That all of your books are like that. So as somebody with a lot of ideas, what was it about finding the headwaters of the longest river in the world that caught your interest and inspired you to bring us River of the Gods?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, interestingly, it really relates to what you're saying. I was working at National Geographic magazine when I first heard the story. This was 20 years ago. And I was obviously steeped in that world, the world of exploration, the world of the quest for knowledge in all of its many forms. And I was just fascinated with the personal aspects of the story as well. These two very, very different men and their friendship, and then the betrayal of that friendship. And so it just had always been in the back of my mind. And I'm always looking for story ideas, book ideas. And so after I finished my book about Winston Churchill, it kind of kept occurring to me. And I thought, I just don't know. We live in this very, very different world now where we understand that this isn't just about, Europeans going into Africa or Asia or wherever they went and discovering places where millions of people had lived for millions of years. So, but then when I was reading it, I read about Sidi Bombay, and it all clicked for me. The understanding of the people who lived there actually making these expeditions possible, actually really, really contributing significantly to the mapping of these worlds. And that, to me, made it something that I wanted to write about, that I wanted personally to learn more about.
You bring back some of these people that are so easy to just skim by, and it's a real talent. And you do that here
Thank
with these three men: Richard Francis Burton, Lieutenant John Hanning Speck. Is it? I meant to ask you
Speak.
beforehand.
Yeah.
Speak. Okay.
Speak, yeah.
Speke. My
That's a hard
oversight.
one. Right.
Yeah, I always like to ask before or look it up, but since nobody's really talked about him in a while until we get to
Right.
re-meet him in River of the Gods.
A lot of people call him Speck. Yeah.
And Sidi Bombay.
Right.
So say we are arriving at their camp on those reedy banks of the Nile, and you're going to tell me, first of all, hey, this guy's name is not Speck, it's Speak, or little things like that. What would you tell me? These are the three guys we're going to meet. Here's how you approach each one. Here's what you're going to get from each one, because that's exactly what you do here in River of the Gods.
Well, I think that the first person we would notice right away would be Richard Francis Burton, who was just striking in every conceivable way. He was just one of these once in a century characters, right? He was an incredible explorer already, first Englishman to enter Mecca disguised as a Muslim, because his Arabic was practically flawless, and he could cite a quarter of the Quran by heart. He also, let's just say, he studied every culture and religion and respected none. So he had no concerns about, entering. I mean, there's a reason this is a forbidden city, but he didn't care, right? But he spoke 25 different languages at least, plus another dozen or so dialects. He was just absolutely brilliant and very strange. He was interested in absolutely everything. He would try any drug, he would try any sex. He was fascinated by sex. He was just like very alarming to Victorian England, especially. And he was also riveting to look at. Everyone who met him described his black hair and his black eyes, and especially even his teeth. So Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula, would go on later to write Dracula, met him and was mesmerized. He was obsessed with Burton, and he talked about his gleaming incisors, his gleaming teeth, and he literally said, like a dagger. And so people think he may have been inspiration for Dracula. And then you meet John Hanning Speke, who is Burton's opposite in almost every way. So he was what Britons expected their heroes to be. So he was fine-boned, blonde hair, blue-eyed. He was born in the aristocracy. He was a lieutenant in the British Army. He loved to hunt. And he seemed very sort of quiet and modest, but actually inside of him was this burning ambition. And he very quickly came to envy and then resent Burton, his commander, deeply. And it turned into this just festering hatred that ended up destroying them both. And then you meet Sidi Bombay, who really very quickly became the heart of this expedition and really the hero of this expedition. He had been kidnapped as a child from his village in East Africa, taken to Zanzibar, where he was sold for cloth, and then taken to Western India, where he was enslaved for 20 years. When the man who owned him died, he was given his freedom. He made his way back to East Africa, and he became really, I think it's hard to argue, the most accomplished guide in the history of African exploration.
He's really somebody who not only jumps off the page, but you have a picture of him later in life that I'll show for people that are watching via YouTube. And it reminded me of something that Pope John Paul II said, and he said, do not look away from age. Don't be pushing people to say, oh, only youth matters and that age, because he's clearly a man who's lived this huge, tough life. You literally read the scars on his face. You could see it in his teeth. And yet he has this huge smile. And this is a guy I want to meet when I find out he was held in slavery, and he walked how many miles he over the course of his life traveled?
They estimate around 6,000 miles. He became, along with Bernie Levitt Cameron, the first to cross the entire continent from east to west, sea to sea. But like you were saying, to me, what's most striking about Sidi Bombay is he had this incredible kindness, this incredible generosity, this unbelievable spirit, even coming out of having lost everything, having been treated like unimaginably, enslaved for almost 20 years. How does he emerge from that with the softest of hearts? Again and again, people are like, oh, he's just not tough enough with the porters, he's just, but always appreciative when he would show such kindness and generosity to them, including to Burton and Speke. I mean, Speke never wanted to go anywhere in East Africa with Bombay, and many people felt that way.
Well, it brings me perfectly to my next question about River of the Gods, and that's a quote, and it's from a poem that somebody wrote about Bombay. And there you go. If you're somebody that inspired you here to write River of the Gods, but also inspiring people to write poetry, I think it says something. And the quote is, "The lake rippled from one end of the world to the other, wide as a sea cradled in a giant's palm." So I wanted to ask you to take that, and just as people are fascinated here with Bombay, how fascinated they are with the Nile itself, and how in the Victorian era, the way that they looked at that river of the gods, compares to how we would look at it today.
Well, interesting. Yeah. And I'll say the interesting thing too about that poem is it was written by an Indian poet, Ranjit Haskote, who's this incredible poet. And I love the beauty of that was where Bombay was enslaved for so long. And now today, one of their premier poets is immortalizing and giving this appreciation of Bombay in a beautiful, beautiful poem about him that he so kindly let me excerpt for the beginning of my book. So, obviously in the Victorian age, people were fascinated with the Nile for many reasons, but especially because they didn't know where it began, right? And this was a mystery that had been going on for thousands of years. Ancient philosophers, Egyptian kings, everyone had been wondering where is the source of the Nile and trying to find out. So that was an obsession at that time. And for many reasons. I mean, the Nile is fascinating for many reasons. Obviously, it's the longest river in the world. It's the most storied river in the world. And it brought life to one of the richest and oldest civilizations on earth, the Egyptian civilization. So, 96%, even today, 96% of Egyptians live along the banks of the Nile River because the rest is a desert. So it literally brings life to this world. And for that reason, we're still obsessed with it, even though, okay, now we know, and we can look at satellite pictures, we can look and see what the source was. And we can anticipate any problems. I think at that time, because so much life relied on the Nile River, it's more than 4,000 miles long. The fear is, is it going to overflow? It does, right? It floods its banks. And that both is a good thing, but it also can be a very dangerous thing. Or B, is it going to go away? So you don't know where it comes from. There's this fear, will it stop coming, right? One day. And so, but even today, the stories, the history, the beauty, the majesty. I mean, I think still today, it's hard to meet anybody who doesn't want to go to Egypt, right? And immerse themselves in this incredible beauty and history, but also, what's happening today. And the Nile is at the heart of that.
We're still so fascinated by all the pharaohs and movies, books, TV shows, everything that has shown us in pop culture. Yeah.
Yes. And
like you said, people love to travel. They love to read about it. And it's just a fascinating. Cleopatra, we haven't even mentioned her yet.
Right.
But there's just so much to talk about. And this river, River of the Gods, shows us the very center of it, and how this generation in the golden age of exploration, they went back and they decided we're going to solve this big mystery of our time and for all time up to then. And then you share that with us, because I can tell you got really sucked up in it too, right? You're almost an Egyptologist now.
Yeah, I don't know. That would be great. I would love that. But yeah, it really truly is irresistible once you start learning about it. And it's fascinating too to think about. So, at this time in the Victorian era, earlier, people were fascinated by Rome and Greece, right? And they taught their children those languages, and the priests, and that was where their focus, and that's what they studied in school. And then it was at the end of the 18th century when they found the Rosetta Stone, and they realized this unlocked this whole other world, right, of hieroglyphics and demotics, and now we can start to understand this world. And it really shifted their focus, and they're like, yeah, Rome and Greece, but this is an even older, richer civilization. We need to know more about that. And, people had been trying, as I said, for thousands of years to figure out where the source of the Nile is. The problem was they were starting at the Mediterranean Sea and ascending the river by going south, right? But then they would quickly hit what is called the slug, these swamplands, and nobody could get through them. And it didn't. They tried again and again and again, and never happened. And it wasn't until the mid 1850s when they realized, okay, what we need to do, we need to take a completely different approach. We're going to start well below the equator, and we're going to go into the interior. And they had no idea what was in there. They just believed that this is where we're going to find the source of the White Nile.
You mentioned the Rosetta Stone there, and
right.
That's one of those things that in the past 120 years maybe has just come to mean something that's a translation, that's a cipher, probably to young people today. But at the time, I wanted you to mention that in this quest, what does that mean? What's the practical application of now being able to read some of those hieroglyphics and help them figure out? Because you think about how big this area is, and you're walking into it, and you'd like to maybe have something to give you a guide. So what role does the actual Rosetta Stone play after they're able to translate some things?
So, well, the Rosetta Stone was really the inspiration for like remembering it and remembering, it had always been absolutely one of those, the holy grail of exploration, right? But people were going all around the world trying, there were a lot of places to quote unquote discover, right? Or to map for Europeans in the Western world, to try to map, to try to understand the rest of our world, which is just a very, very natural human characteristic. And it's in many ways it's a good thing, our natural curiosity. It can lead to bad things, obviously, and in this case, it did. Without doubt, it was the direct and intended consequence of this exploration was invasion and colonization. So bad things come out of it. But the essential desire to understand our world is just a very human characteristic, and obviously goes on today. And so the Rosetta Stone inspired that, again, the beauty and the richness and the very ancient nature of this world, and the Nile being very much at the heart of it. And as you say, but nobody knew, right? There was like no information for people on the outside about what lay inside. And so what happened was in about, I think it was 1853, the Royal Geographical Society, so this vaunted society of science and exploration in London, it's this map. And it was drawn by these two German missionary explorers who they thought, this like moment of insight. Like people had assumed that there was like a desert in the interior of Africa. And they said, no, there's one sea, one vast inland sea. And so they drew this gigantic sea. It was just huge. And people struggled to describe it. And so it became known as the slug map. It just looked like a giant slug, right? And they believed that that was the source of the Nile. So the Nile is so enormous, so mind-blowingly huge, that its source has to be equally large. And in a way they're wrong, right? In a way they're wrong, because it turned out was not just one huge sea, but three enormous seas, and one of them was the source.
Amazing to think of how much it was like. I was trying to think of a comparison. Going to Mars, think about how hungry we are and how fascinated when we get some information. But at least people have been to Egypt. But it's hard to speak, maybe to read, but that's really what this would have felt like. This is really going into the unknown.
Right. And it's, very far from Egypt. So no one had gone, again, you can't get there by going south on the river, by ascending the river. You've got to cut through. And it finally worked.
I love that part of River of the Gods, and in your other work as well, that you bring us back to that time and really hammered into our minds as readers, gently, of course. I'm not saying that it's not a literal hammer, but it's a talent. Hammer's not the right word, but
Thank
the
you.
way that you the way that you bring us back is reminding us that this is a time. For instance, I have a friend who's in Dubai right now as we're recording this. He text messages me just as if he was right next door in the same room, or in the US. Like, you get it instantly, right? And that's the thing in River of the Gods, where you take us back. And I wondered if there's some of those things that you do when you're building your novel. You're writing River of the Gods and you say, wow, this is a really good way to remind people or show them just how different the technology was, and therefore, even though the people were the same and that yearning to explore was the same, the challenge that these men face is completely different.
Absolutely. And that's something I think it's really hard to wrap your mind around. You think these men spent years away from home, years in the interior, and traveled thousands of miles by foot. They had donkeys that were always running away or breaking down, but most of it, by foot, carrying everything that they needed, again, for years. Sometimes they would leave stuff and hope that another expedition coming through could bring it to them to resupply. But it was really difficult, and they faced like just unimaginable challenges, the kinds of things that you think, I'm really glad I'm just reading about this and not experiencing for myself. The diseases alone that they experienced. I mean, both men were blinded for months at a time. Burton had such severe malaria, he was paralyzed for almost a year. While they're on this incredibly grueling expedition, he can't walk. He has to be carried, and he's a big guy. Although by that time, he had lost a lot of weight, because they're also near starvation constantly, and he can't even hold a pen. And that's who he was. He was constantly writing. Before this first expedition began, when they were in Somalia starting out, they were attacked one night. And again, so they're going into this world that they don't know anything about, but obviously people have lived there for millions of years, and they have not been invited to this land, and they definitely represents potential danger to these people. So there is obviously the danger of attack, just out of defense by the peoples who live there. And they were attacked one night, and Speke was stabbed 11 times. I mean, it was just a miracle that he survived. And Burton had a javelin thrust through his jaw from cheek to cheek, and for like hours he had it. He couldn't get it out, and for the rest of his life, he had this really long, jagged scar down his cheek, which made him seem even sort of more suspicious and dangerous character than Britain's already thought he was. So, the what they overcame was incredible. It was really a very, very dangerous expedition, not just for them, but for all of the men in the expedition, because all their porters and things, they didn't know a lot of this land too, and they didn't know the peoples who lived there, but they knew more than Burton and Speke, so they knew to be afraid, and they were right.
The dangers are one thing, because that's very vivid to write about, and people tend to remember that and write it down, and that's great for your narrative. And it was the same sort of thing of uncontacted tribes when you wrote River of Doubt, because there's Theodore Roosevelt in this group, and they're watching them the whole time, and he has
the Saint Larga, right?
Yeah, I would just invite people to go read it, and he's going there, and that just a way that needs to be handled, and his partner in the expedition, and that's all really vivid, and obviously I'm remembering it now. But another aspect of the lack of technology is there's a lot of downtime in an expedition. You think about even when you go on your own vacation today, there's a lot of time in a plane, and that's not really exciting or interesting. So I wondered, for example, when they're about to enter the monsoon season where they can't travel, and then they're also sitting, languishing in Zanzibar when it's the dry season, so they can't go anywhere. I wondered... What were they doing during that time, and how did those things help you in writing this story and telling River of the Gods, so that you could show us, or at least get something from, how our explorers used that free time, that downtime, even the time that they were sick or stabbed and recovering, so that you could help tell their story?
Yeah, it's actually a gift to a writer because there are things that, yeah, it's fun, obviously, and those kind of write themselves, whether, the attack or, when they're really sick, or there's this like, Speak gets this beetle in his ear and ends up deafening himself. Those things are easy to describe, but there are things that you also questions that you have to answer. So obviously readers are going to be like, but, well, how did they get all of these supplies? Did they bring everything with them? That seems crazy. How are they going to do that? How did they hire their porters? How do you structure an expedition like this at this time? And so when they're there, that gives me the opportunity to do that. And to me, at least, and I hope to the readers, it's fascinating, especially they're in Zanzibar. And I had the great pleasure and honor to go to Zanzibar when I was researching this book, and it is everything that you would hope it would be. It's like every conceivable color and smell and sight. I mean, just like it's just this. You're just awash in senses, right? It's just an incredibly beautiful, rich and world, and it was at that time as well. And there are these huge markets. Even today, I went into these markets, and they're selling just everything. And there's, again, just your senses are on overload, and so that's where they got a lot of their supplies. So I can talk about the kind of money that they use. And they're always talking about dollars. This was this many dollars. I was like, dollars? But it was an old Maria Theresa dollar that they would use for trading, that they had used even at that time. It had been like 100 of years that they had been using this type of currency. So to me, it's really fascinating what they're doing with that time, how they're preparing and how they're, it was at that time that they met Bombay, when they were kind of like, oh, let's do a little exploring around here before we can go into the interior. And they met Bombay, who became, as I said, the heart of their expedition. So, and even when they're off and they're sort of at a point where they have to rest and wait, they use that time to repairing their tents, repairing their clothing are like in rags, so they're trying to get cloth so they can sew more clothes to wear, trying to get more food, trying to be prepared enough to move on, not only physically, but in all the other supplies that they need. So yeah, that's definitely part of the process. And to me, at least, it's a really, really interesting part of it.
You're enjoying my conversation with Candice Millard. She's author of River of the Gods, Genius, Courage, and Betrayal in the Search for the Source of the Nile. Visit her at CandiceMillard.com, and from there you can find her Twitter and Facebook accounts. I can promise you she is active there, and you'll be glad to keep track of what she's doing because it's a lot of really great history and fun storytelling. Publishers Weekly says of River of the Gods, Millard's lushly detailed adventure story keeps a steady eye on the racial power dynamics involved in this imperialist endeavor and brilliantly illuminates the characters of Burton, Speke, and Bombay. Readers will be riveted. Now, Candice, I did want to touch on that, and earlier we talked about Bombay a little, but I just pushed it a little bit later because this is something that is important because you're writing about a period a long time ago with different social conventions, and you're dealing with somebody in Mr. Bombay that had been written out of the story, that wasn't a convenient guy. Here we want this dashing Burton, even though he wouldn't have been somebody you'd want to meet. He was endlessly fascinating for the press there, right? And it was like, well, yeah, he had a guide, I guess, and it was just some guy. Yeah. And so let's move on. And I guess that's natural. You'll tell stories about people that look like you. But what we don't like to look back on, and what is cringeworthy, is two things that are your challenge as I see it in writing River of the Gods. And that's, on the one hand, you don't want to gloss over the fact that this is an era where there are many negatives from the colonialism, that you have people who, it's almost a international spring break and people are dying and they're just, well, we're going to go and we want to go see this town. So we're going to, and they ruin it because just carelessness or ignorance, or just because they are genuinely bad people sometimes. But also, you don't want to fall into the Rudyard Kipling trap and start writing take up the white man's burden and look at somebody like Sidi Bombay as, oh, he's almost a pet to them, and you don't want readers to read that. You have a challenge because you want to be honest about everything and even. And I love that you do that in River of the Gods. So I wanted to ask you about how you wrote about that? How did you deal with the period of colonialism without going too far to it being scolding, or too far to it being that you just completely ignored it and you're not doing justice to the people that suffered while these guys are going through and looking all over these other countries trying to find things?
Well, I hope I did it well. It was definitely the biggest challenge of this book. As you say, first of all, I wanted to be very, very honest about not just the things that happened, but also the things that they wrote about later, and the legacy that this racism carried with it, that we are still living with today. I wanted to touch on all of that to the extent that I could, but also I wanted to make sure that we wrote back into the narrative I feel like I'm quoting Hamilton here, but that we told the story again, to the extent that we could, about these people who made these expeditions possible. And I'm obviously far from the first person to do this. This has been going on, thankfully, for a while now. And the Royal Geographical Society has really made an effort to their credit. I mean, in the past, obviously, when Burton and Speke were there, especially there were these armchair geographers, these gentlemen scientists who would pretend to, of course, you can never trust what someone who actually lives there has to tell you about it, but at the same time, they all use that information. I mean, that was the information that they had, right? They would go there and immediately start asking people, what have you seen? Where have you traveled? What can you tell us? What advice can you give me? And then they would pretend like that never happened. And I'm just this this person who knows everything, right? I'm just incredibly knowledgeable, and I've seen this for myself. So I wanted to, again, to the extent that I could, and in the most respectful way that I could, say, hey, let's be honest here. None of this would have happened. These guys would have not gotten 2 feet into the African interior without people who actually lived there, and they certainly would not have understood it, and it, again, everybody has a different feeling about these things, but to me, I call Lake Victoria the Nyanza. I mean, these places had a name, and to think of, I mean, this is the Nyanza, which is the source of the White Nile and is the largest lake in Africa, the largest freshwater lake in the world, is named for an English queen. I mean, it just seems crazy to me. And the same with the Rosetta Stone. Again, nobody loves the British Museum more than I do, but the Rosetta Stone is at the British Museum, not in Alexandria. They have a copy in Alexandria. So I don't know. These are all things that we are, fortunately, as a people, humankind, we're dealing with now, and we're talking about, and we are making progress, but obviously there's still a long way to go. So in my very, very small way, I mean, obviously there was no way I could tell the story without addressing the racism of the time and the legacy of that racism, and without saying, hey, Sidi Bombay, you need to know about him. You need to know about these other porters. And so that was really, I wouldn't have written the book if I couldn't do that. Whether I did a good job, whether I did it justice, I don't know. I hope so. I tried really, really hard. I spent 5 years working on this, and I spent a lot of that time trying to figure out how to tell the story fairly. And I don't know, I did my best.
It's something you read in both books, or get from both books, this one and River of Doubt, where people doubt, and there's that element of, I mentioned Indiana Jones, right? When they're always stealing work from each other, these archaeologists in those movies. Right. And that's a thing with TR.
And in real life.
Here he only almost kills himself to do this mapping of the River of Doubt, and then they say, "Oh, he didn't do it," and he has that great line about, "What do they think? Do they think I took the subway basically and just popped out at the other end, and my body's ruined by this, right?"
Yeah, and the great thing about a river is it's still there, so you don't believe me, go find out for yourself.
Yeah.
Good luck.
But that was something about Burton there too, though, that was redeeming, I guess you'd say, and that's that he doesn't participate in slavery in Islamic and African nations. And as I'm reading it at the time, you really don't want to like this guy, and it wouldn't be surprising if Dracula was based on him, right? He's always just so brusque, and he's it has no respect for anybody or anything. And then you say, oh, if this was a novel, you would never tell me this noble, forward-thinking quality that he had, and yet here it is. So I like that, and I think in the hands of an author that did have an agenda and didn't want to tell a fair story, a human story, it'd be so easy to leave things like that out. So I like that you put that in, because we all have our faults, and right. By seeing him that way, it makes it, again, not just that, well, the guide is perfect, and this right. guy's really evil, and I just really like that, and it keeps you reading as a reader when you pick up River of the Gods. And I wanted to ask you something about that quote too, and that's about the fact that you spent 5 years on this, and that Publishers Weekly recommendation for your book called it lushly detailed. When we spoke about Hero of the Empire, you explained to me you use this star process when you're doing your notes, and we're both big highlighters. If people are watching on YouTube, they can see we have competing bookshelves here, which I think is absolutely fantastic. In fact, there was an article on you recently in the New York Times, right? That you've given up. Was it the New York Times? Given up on organizing your books. So here we go. Here, this is proof of it. They look pretty neat. But give us some examples of those 1 stars, the 4 stars. Explain to people what the things were in there that were right on that line, and you said, I wish I could have included it, and maybe an example of something that you did include, and you said, wow, this jumps right off the page at me. How did that research work for 5 years to bring people River of the Gods and make it a book that people really can enjoy? And it's just like sailing down that smooth river when you're reading it. There's nothing that's herky-jerky. You're not going to capsize.
Thank you. Well, I'll start about talking just a little bit about the research I did for this book, which was so fun, so interesting. So early in the process, I was able to go to the UK and did a lot of research in that area. Obviously, the Royal Geographical Society, most of my time there, the British Library, Royal Asiatic Society, went to Edinburgh to the National Library of Scotland. And something that comes later is the sort of shocking tragedy near the end of the book. I was able to go where that happened, and it's still in the same family, that house, that land, and it was really an incredible experience. But obviously what I was most looking forward to and I most needed to do was to get to East Africa. As you can imagine, that's a big trip, especially, I have 3 kids. One is in college now, but at the time they're all at home. And whenever I go on a research trip or I go, on a book tour, my parents would come and stay with me. But it's hard to find a time. So I was going to be gone a month, and it's hard to find a time where that works, right? And I'm not going to be missing something important or whatever. And it works for everybody's schedule. So I was trying for years to make that happen. And finally, I landed on February of 2020. And so I knew that obviously, there was a problem in China at that time, and I knew, what's going on in Europe a little bit, but there was really not much in the United States at that time. And so I really wasn't worried about going to East Africa. But as I'm traveling, so I go to Kenya, Zanzibar, Tanzania, Uganda, I'm moving. And I'm thinking, oh, wait, things are looking kind of iffy back home. Things are getting worse and worse and worse with the pandemic. So I finally was able to get home. I got home, I think it was like March 10th of 2020. So like right before the doors closed. So yeah, my children were very nervous. Are you coming back? It's bad. But what happened is I was able to get all this information, really just seeing so much time, just so much is just in going to these places, like you mentioned, River of Doubt, going to the Amazon and understanding. You're like, what? This is the richest ecosystem on the planet, and these guys are supposed to be these great hunters. How are they starving to death? And you go there and you're like, oh, I get it. Everything's eating you. If there's anything you can eat, good luck, right? You see, because of evolution, right? Everything has evolved to be a very good predator or to not be prey. And that involves silence and hiding. So it was the same thing of going to East Africa and trying to understand these huge expanses of land that they traveled, and the variety of the different habitations that they encountered, and meeting some of the peoples, today who were there at that time. It was just absolutely fascinating and enriching. And so then coming back and trying to organize all of that material, as you talked about, that is a huge undertaking. And so, so I have the system where I, star something where it's, this is good, I should 2 stars, or you should definitely use it. 3 stars, you'd be a complete idiot if you don't use this. And surprisingly, I mean, obviously the things that we talked about that they endured, you're definitely going to want to get that in. But some of the things that I found that were just interesting to me are some of these little stories of history that you would stop and tell a friend. For instance, during the Crimean War, so that also happens in the middle of this, right? Both Burton and Speke go to fight in the Crimean War. And these, as often happens in wars, for some reason, these people become heroes, right? And that kind of goes out into the world, into the population as products that you can then buy. And so, for instance, the commander-in-chief of the British Army in the Crimean War was the Baron of Raglan. And he had lost an arm in the Napoleonic Wars 40 years earlier. And so they stitched for him this new kind of sleeve. Instead of starting here, it started at an angle, right? It was one long piece from the shoulder down to the sleeve, this angled thing, and they called it the Raglan sleeve from him. And so now we think of, the Raglan sleeve, baseball players wear it and things, but that's where it came from. Also, the Earl of Cardigan, who started wearing these wool vests that buttoned up the front, and they called them cardigans. And that's where this. So to me, those little bits of history at the side, it's not central to it, but I love it because to me, it's just fascinating, and it's the kind of thing I would stop and tell my husband, "Did you know?" And so I love adding those things.
You mentioned the idea of going there early in Zanzibar, and you said, "Wow, the sensory input that I'm getting,"
right.
and that's so key to good writing and good history, is to walk the land, to be there, but also for good writing. They always say touch all the senses, and you do
Right.
that. And I mentioned your bookshelf, and I just have books, and I'm realizing your bookshelves look much better behind you, because mine are a little like the soup cans and Sleeping with the Enemy. I just realized maybe I need to break it up and put my Theodore Roosevelt bust on there, of which I have two,
Looks
which
great.
sounds really crazy.
This is not my office. So this is just downstairs
Okay.
in my home. I had to be home today, but my office looks like yours.
Well, we have that video from your website. I've seen that, and I likened it to a starship last time that I saw your office, how you have all those screens, and it's just, that's for serious work. But I wanted to mention it because you have something on the shelf that's not a book, but that is so precious, and I'll flash up a picture of it here for people watching on YouTube, but it's a vial. And I wanted you to tell me what's the story behind that, and what does that mean to you? And your eye catches it there on your shelf.
Right. That was actually interesting. It's a vial of the water from the Amazon River. So a friend of mine was one of the first, and I can't remember the details of it, but he was one of the first to go down by canoe or kayak or something on the Amazon. And he sent me a vial of the water as a gift, as an homage to Theodore Roosevelt's adventure on the River of Doubt.
Did you get any water? Did you think of that when you were over there traveling, or scoop it up, or is a reader going to read River of the Gods? And...
Yeah, I should have gotten some Nile. I didn't when I was there, but it was, to me, it's the experience, it's the memories of being there, and the most incredible thing. And I can send you. I have a picture of me right at the spot where the Nile rushes out of the Nyanza, and that was the most, really, probably the highlight of the trip, the most extraordinary moment, because it's just breathtaking to think what this thing gives birth to.
I wanted to pass along a question from Todd Arrington, who's at the James A. Garfield Historic Site.
Yeah.
And I interviewed him previously about his book on the 1880 election. I would encourage people to listen to that, and also to read that book, because that's exciting.
Really good book.
Times, right? Mm-hmm. And here you have the only time, rather, that two Civil War veterans square off against each other. And since you are so identified with James A. Garfield, you're the Garfield gal, and people say, "Oh, okay, she's."
That's an
And
honor.
and it is an honor. Gosh, he's,
Yeah.
he's the greatest president we never had, right? And he is somebody who, when you're a presidential historian or you do a book on presidents, there's always that core of people that want you to write more about that and that are more
Right.
fascinated. And so when I was speaking to Todd, he said, there's not really a Garfield connection, but I wonder what her pitch would be to people, or how you'd tell people if they just love Destiny of the Republic, and millions of people do, and rightly so. It's an excellent book. How would you explain to them that this is a book that has some similarities, or my style at my core as a writer is here? And if you picked up this book about a president you maybe never heard of before and his wacky assassin,
Right.
the kindest thing anyone's ever said probably about that guy, who I will not name, but anyway, how do you explain to people and say, hey, if you enjoyed that book, even if you're just into presidents, even if you're not from Egypt, even if you're one of the people that doesn't really care about it sounds very dusty and old mummies and I don't care, what will your pitch be when you speak to people who are Garfield supporters about why they should pick up River of the Gods and go on a new adventure and learn the same sorts of things from you and all your careful research that they learned from reading that Garfield book?
Well, I think that what this has in common with the Garfield book is it's sort of epic in nature. What I write about is very narrow, right? Moments in time, but they have lasting implications. And even at the time, they were incredibly, incredibly important, and the people in them, made a huge difference at that time, and still today. And so what I love about history, I love it, and I'm sure you get the same thing. People will come up to me and say, I thought I didn't like history. I thought history was really boring. And then I read this book and it totally changed my life. And so what I always say about narrative nonfiction is that, to me, it's the gateway drug of history, right? And so you think you don't like it, but then you read something by Eric Larson or Laura Hillenbrand or whomever it is, whoever
Candice
just
Millard.
like grabs, incredibly rich detail. And I mean, and the beauty of it, it's about people, right? And human nature. And so this book is about genius and envy and ambition and betrayal, all these things that we know we see in ourselves, we see in the people around us. So human nature, when everything else changes, human nature always stays the same. And it's always fascinating to people, right? And so whatever you read, you're going to find some connection, something you're like, I see it. Of course he would do that. I know Joe, and he always is something, it's very similar. And so you can understand it, right? And you can connect to it. And it's absolutely fascinating. And then you're learning something it's not painful. You're not dreading. You're like, I can't put it down at night, but you're learning, you're increasing your knowledge, which we all want, but in this effortless way, and again, though, I hope it then opens a door for people to deeper reading, more academic histories or biographies that are cradle to grave that are so fascinating. I think once you fall in love with a book of history, as you know better than anyone, then you go down this chute, right? And there's no going back. And so I hope that this book will be that to some people. It's absolutely adventure, and it's absolutely, my kids always make fun of me for writing about these gruesome things, but they're fascinating. And, we don't have to experience them. We can read about them. But you learn something, and it's really, it's absolutely epic. It kind of has it all. So I hope that this book might open that door for somebody new.
Well, this book, River of the Gods, certainly does have it all. Thank you so much. She is Candice Millard. I want to thank her on behalf of everybody that's listening and watching. Her book, by the way, River of the Gods, it ends with the line, "The thought will haunt me to death." And that would make a great first line. And so I'm going to tease everybody. You're going to want to pick up this book and find out a little hint of mystery there, even in this book. River of the Gods is so much fun. It will stick with you for a very long time. You will not be haunted by it, but it does have some haunting imagery, beautiful, beautiful prose, and men that we should definitely get to know, warts and alls, with their flaws, and see a little bit of ourselves, as you were just saying, in this book, Candice. So I hope readers will pick it up. And again, I thank you so much for spending time with me today. I look forward to reading your next book. I hope it's not 5 years, but I know that it'll be worth the wait.
Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed the conversation.
Again, the book is River of the Gods, Genius, Courage, and a Betrayal in the Search for the Source of the Nile. As always, you can find the Amazon link to purchase your copy at thehistoryauthor.com page for this episode. By buying a book through us, you help keep the flux capacitor on our time machine humming like usual. My sincere thanks to Candice Millard. Boy, is she a lot of fun to talk to. Boy, is this a great book. These insights into this exciting quest, this race to discover the source of the Earth's greatest river, at least the longest river, was really something that I enjoyed, and I'm so glad that she came and shared that magic with all of us. You can visit her at CandiceMillard.com and from there navigate through to her Twitter and Facebook accounts. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do check out our previous interview about that Winston Churchill origin story that was called Hero of the Empire. And you can subscribe for future adventures on our YouTube channel, or you can check out historyauthor.com and stream everything from there. Please do check out those 250 interviews that are in our archives. I'm sure you'll find something you like, but none you'll like more than these interviews with Candice Millard. What a great storyteller. Please do check out my social media accounts as well. You can find those at historyauthor.com. But for now, that's it for this installment of the History Author Show. I hope you'll join us for our next all-new interview right here on iHeartRadio, or wherever you enjoyed this journey into yesterday. Until that next trip into the past together, on behalf of Candice Millard, thanks so much for time traveling with us today, and have a great week.
We still call it Broadway, but what's in a name? Take it from Georgie, it isn't the same. On the east side, west side, things ain't like before. There are tears in the eyes of the regular guys. Oh, New York ain't New York anymore.